Hello, listeners. Today we'll be talking about the psychological impacts that exposure to violence has on children. Here to join us today is Professor Rowell Huesmann, an accomplished professor in the psychology department here at the University of Michigan. How are you today, Professor?
I'm good. I should say I'm also in the communication studies department as well as the psychology department and the Institute for Social Research.
All right, great. Let's jump right into it. So the first question, what has the majority of your research been focused around?
The majority of my research has been focused around the development of aggression and violence in children as they grow up to be adults, and what makes some children much more aggressive and violent than others.
What inspired you to study this specific topic?
Well, I was at that point in my career when I was starting to do research. I was actually at Yale University, and I had two very young children. I began to worry about them, how they would grow up, and if they'd grow up to be aggressive and violent. And I had a colleague there, Leonard Aron, who was very interested in that topic. So we started collaborating. And in particular, we started research on a large sample of children in Columbia County, New York, which was the first real long-term study on development of aggressive behavior in children. And one thing led to another, and I just kept doing that all my life.
So what makes children particularly vulnerable to the effects of violence exposure?
You know, it's no one thing. I think the best way to think about it is that violence is really an infectious disease. Now, we all know about COVID right now. Well, think about violence as also an infectious disease. It's different in some respects. To catch COVID, you need to be close to someone who has COVID. To catch violence, you only need to be observing someone who's violent and hear about it. So it's different in that way, but it's similar in many other ways too. I mean, some people are very resistant to biological diseases. Some people are more susceptible. Some people are resistant to being influenced by the violence around them. Other people are very resistant to it. So I think the best way to think about it is that it's an infectious disease.
Interesting. So in a recent publication that you co-authored titled Longitudinal Predictions of Young Adults' Weapon Use and Criminal Behavior from Their Childhood Exposure to Violence, you say that more early exposure to family weapon use, violent video game playing, neighborhood gun violence, and movie violence predicts more carrying and use of weapons and more arrests for weapon use and crime. Is it safe to say that the earlier the exposure to weapons, the more likely the individual is to be affected? And if yes, why might earlier exposure lead to more effects?
Okay, well, first of all, these kinds of longitudinal studies really don't prove causation. I mean, so I would really say I'm certain they increase the risk for behaving violently and aggressively later on. Secondly, it's the reason why early exposure is much more important is because the very young child is just developing what I call social schemas for how to behave. And he's very pliable, very easy to teach. So his exposure at that age really increases the likelihood that he will acquire scripts for solving social problems with aggression and violence. And once those are acquired and they're repeatedly acquired, then they tend to become crystallized and you can see them much later in life. It's much harder to change a person when they're an adult than to change them when they're a child, is what it comes down to.
In your 2006 publication titled Short-Term and Long-Term Effects of Violent Media on Aggression in Children and Adults, you say that action heroes are more dangerous teachers of violent behavior than villains. So why is it that the action heroes in the media make more of an impact on children than villains?
Well, it has to do with this learning. You know, if you identify with someone, then you're more likely to imitate what they're doing. It's very simple. And you're more likely to identify with an action hero than a villain. So a child is more likely to imitate what they see a great action hero doing than a villain doing. So contrary to what a lot of people might think, therefore observing heroic action heroes who get reinforced for what the violent behavior they're doing has a more detrimental effect on teaching children to behave aggressively. than villains do. But I should say one other thing about short-term and long-term effects. There's a different reason why there are real short-term effects of viewing violence, and that's what we call priming effects. Once you've encoded scripts in your memory for how to behave, what makes you think about them and recall them and follow them? Well, something that primes them in memory, something that triggers them. And it's been shown that just the sight of weapons will trigger all sorts of aggressive scripts, the ideas, thinking about it, and therefore make it more likely that you'll behave aggressively or violently. This is quite different from this long-term effect I was talking about where you acquire the scripts. But what it means is that even a short-term exposure to violence, or just a short-term exposure to weapons is actually likely to increase the risk that you'll behave aggressively. Interesting, if I can say one more thing. This is one other reason people don't often talk about why open carrying of weapons is not a good idea. Because the sight of weapons makes people think about aggression and violence, and therefore triggers these kinds of scripts in many people. Not everyone, but many people. So they will be more likely to behave aggressively when they see weapons than they otherwise would.
So, are there any particular settings that once a child is exposed to violence, they're more likely to experience negative impacts, such as school, home, or in the community?
Well, not particularly because of the setting, but because of the elements in the setting that might prime these kinds of scripts. So I've already talked about how weapons can prime aggressive scripts, but also observing any other violence or aggression can also prime those kinds of scripts. And even observing things that are not really aggression, but things that have been related in the past to aggression. For example, there's one study was done that showed that when people had been exposed to violence in a room of a particular color, and then later on, they were in a room of that color, they were more likely to behave aggressively towards another person than they were in a room of a different color. Because the color just had become associated with the aggressive behavior when they experienced it, so it primed the idea of aggressive behavior. Our memory is very sensitive to being primed by lots of things, and that's what happened.
In a study by Kulkarni et al., researchers found that witnessing violence did not have as strong of an impact on the psychological development of children as experiencing violence firsthand. Would you agree with this conclusion? And if not, why not?
Well, actually, I haven't read the study, so I would be a little bit reluctant to say much about it. But if it means being victimized,
Yeah.
well, victimization, when a person is victimized, they're both observing violence because the other person is victimizing them. And also they're experiencing a strong emotional reaction. So if one is talking about that, it's not surprising then that being victimized has a stronger effect than just observing violence. But as I said, I really don't know the studies.
Okay. Other researchers have found that children who experienced violence has smaller brains and prefrontal abnormalities than their non-exposed counterparts. Have you found any evidence that violence impacts physical development in children as well as psychological health in your own research?
We have found, not directly, but we have found that more aggressive children grow up to have all sorts of problems that are not just aggression. For example, more aggressive children grow up to have more health problems, more problems in work environments, more problems in social environments, in their relationships, and so on, and more mental health problems. And since exposure to violence is one of the primary causes of becoming aggressive, I am pretty sure that it's safe to say that exposure to violence leads to a number of other long-term problems besides just behaving aggressively. And it also, there's a really different effect that sometimes is referred to as post-traumatic stress symptoms, that when you're exposed to violence has this detrimental effect because it produces this strong emotional reaction, and then later on that the same kind of reaction can be triggered by similar events and have very detrimental effects. So it would not be surprising if exposure to violence really caused detectable changes in brain functioning.
Are there any strategies that you have found to be effective in reducing the negative impacts that violence can have on children?
Yes, there are. I mean, the negative impact in terms of promoting aggression and violence. There are studies that show that if you, for example, intervene with children and teach them that the violence they're observing is not the way you should behave and not the way most people behave, if you intervene at an improper period, which is very close to their exposure, then that mitigates the effect of the exposure. So it's not that exposure to violence necessarily determines more aggressive and violent behavior in all children. That's not true. So many interventions can work to reduce the effect of exposure to violence once you recognize that exposure to violence may be having detrimental effects on the child.
Okay, great. So to wrap up, is there anything that you're working on right now that you'd like to share?
Right now, I've been focusing with my colleagues, and I should mention particularly Professor Eric Dubow, who's also at the Institute for Social Research at Michigan. We've been working on a study with subjects from Flint, Michigan, who we followed now for well over 10 years from the time they were children in schools. And we've been looking at which children grow up to adults who are more likely to use weapons, guns, to commit gun violence. And we have pretty good evidence that children who are more exposed to gun violence grow up more likely to use guns in violent interactions with others. So again, it's what we call observational learning, imitation, that has long-term effects, that it's just like, as I said at the start, an infectious disease, except you don't need to be close to the person, you just need to observe them. So children who observe youth or adults using guns are more likely to grow up to use guns.
Great, thank you. That's all we have for this episode. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Huesmann.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Chelsea.